Hello, everyone. Just going to wait a couple more minutes and then we'll kick off. So for those of you who are wondering where I am, you know my normal vista, this isn't my normal vista. I'm in my new office at Leeds. So that's why I don't have any books behind me yet. I don't think I'm not learned. I know.
Whereabouts are you in Leeds, Jane? Are you in still in Baines?
I'm still in the Baines on the second floor. So. Okay, so I think I'll start with a bit of housekeeping whilst we wait for people to arrive. Welcome everybody to this YQSR webinar today. My name is Jane O'Hara. I am a Professor of Healthcare Quality and Safety based at the University of Leeds, which is where I am today. But I'm also Deputy Director supporting Rebecca Lawton within the Yorkshire Quality and Safety Research Group. Rebecca is on leave this week, so she can't be here. So she's asked me to chair this, which of course I'm delighted to do, particularly because it's in an area that's really close to my heart. Before I introduce Liz and we get cracking, just a few housekeeping issues. So I'll bring them up to keep you right. So if everybody could please keep your microphones muted throughout, that would be great. And the second thing is we will be taking questions at the end. I think Liz, thumbs up if you have, you've left some time for questions at the end. So please do use the chat function to discuss what Liz is talking about throughout. But I would encourage you, if you want a question to be asked, to maybe save that towards the end. Although if you do have something burning that you want to put in, my colleague Siobhan will be also trawling through the chat and we'll bump it up the list of questions towards the end. So as I say, put the questions in the chat and I and I will chair those and put those to you, Liz, then at the back end of the talk. The final thing is that we are recording it, as you can see. We usually make these recordings available on our YQSR YouTube channel, which all of our webinars are hosted on. So if you haven't been on there, go on there and have a look. And this one will be uploaded later in the week. So if you aren't okay with that, I would suggest maybe exiting at this point. Hopefully you won't, but we will be recording it, and so Liz herself has consented, so hopefully everybody else will be okay with that. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker today, who's coming out of Leicester. So Liz Sutton is she's a research associate at the Social Science Applied to Healthcare Improvement Research Group, which is also to most people known as the Sapphire Group, which has a reputation that precedes it in terms of all things qualitative in particular, but also more generally quality and safety health services research. I think in your bio you talk about your background in terms of qualitative research, and what I'm so pleased to see that you're going to be talking about today is, as I say, something that's really close to my heart, which is about how patient involvement actually can be expressed maybe or conceived as vulnerability, and how patients manage that vulnerability in healthcare settings. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Liz, and look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that lovely welcome, and hello everybody. It's really delightful to speak here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen so that you can see what I'm going to be talking about. So let's do that now. Has that worked? Can you see that?
You can see it. If you want to just put it onto the slideshow,
Yes, we'll do.
Brilliant.
There we go. Can we all see that?
Perfect.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I know that the Yorkshire group has done some fantastic work around patient involvement and patient safety. And as Jane's alluded to already, I've been a researcher, qualitative researcher, for about 20 odd years. And the last 10 years have been spent at Sapphire doing work around patient safety and quality improvement of healthcare safety. So without further ado, this talk is about how, as Jane has said, about how patients conduct risk and relational work to manage their vulnerability. And that is essentially how I conceive of patient involvement in patient safety in the NHS. So just a brief overview then. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about patient involvement in patient safety very briefly, because I think quite a lot of people already know about some of the work that's been done around this. Then I'm going to talk about the aims and theoretical input of the paper itself. I'm going to then discuss how I did what I did, and then talk about what I found. And before I talk about discussions and conclusions, and then obviously give you the old limitation spiel. And then finally, I wanted to finish with a short video that I've been fortunate enough to create from the findings of my PhD, which is being used for in students' medical education at the minute in Leicester. And I'd be really grateful for your thoughts on that, as well as the rest of the talk. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing that with you. So starting off then, so we know that most of the literature on patient safety and research on patient safety has, until fairly recently, tended to focus on what safety is from the clinician's perspective. And it's essentially focused on preventing incidents, errors and harms, and preventing such things as falls, wrong site surgery, missed or wrong medication doses, things like pressure ulcers. And essentially that's led to research that's primarily driven by technical definitions of safety, and that use predefined models of safety and asks patients to report on incidents and processes according to those predefined or pre-structured categories. So what's the problem with that then? Well, as Jane O'Hara and colleagues there at Yorkshire have found, is that patients frequently identify other issues as important to them. You know, they found that communication or the availability or insufficiency of staff is a real issue as a patient safety issue, and that environmental issues and compassion and dignity have also been of central importance to patients in their framing of what safety is. And also Emily Barrow's work has looked at patients' perspectives of safety and has very much noted that it's about, for patients, safety is about feeling safe rather than just being safe. And we also know that most patient involvement in patient safety literature tends to focus on the formal types of patient involvement, and that is with the distinct aim of improving patient safety. And that can take place at the bedside, and I have to say as a start, this is what I'm talking about today, is what happens at the bedside. But even when it does take place at the bedside, it tends to be planned, coordinated, that sort of thing, and carried out formally. And you know, types of things that are conducted there are questionnaires, surveys, and comment cards, that sort of thing. And so I'd argue that there's little recognition really of how the context of patient safety affects that involvement. So here's some gaps then that I think are really important. So I think that the emotional and the psychosocial, and particularly relational aspects of safety are often less well researched and understood. That is changing, but it's still very much, the relational aspects of safety are not very often referred to in the literature. And patient involvement in patient safety research is often about getting feedback on those aspects of patient safety that can be quantified and measured, because the aim is to improve it. So without knowing what's going on, that can't be done. But we also need to understand what safety means to patients in different contexts in order to understand the patient's own involvement in it, essentially. And, you know, acute care is a particularly difficult context. You know, this is relevant because for many patients, they're admitted urgently, and they may be very frightened or anxious. And we all need to think about how patients are positioned here and how that in fact impacts on their perceptions of safety and their orientation towards their involvement in patient safety. So the aim of this paper, or this article that we're currently writing, I'm currently writing, it's just been resubmitted to Social Science and Medicine. The aim of it is essentially to explore how vulnerability, risk and dependency impacts on how patients understand patient safety and how these factors shape patients' roles in patient safety. So let me talk to you a bit about theories and what we drew on. Well, I drew on Mistle's theory of vulnerabilities for a start, and Barbara Mistle argues that vulnerability is very much a product of dependency, fear and uncertainty. So vulnerability essentially is incredibly complex and multidimensional concept, and it's particularly problematic because it arises in different contexts. But in essence, the literature sort of talks about vulnerability is essentially being at risk of harm or exploitation with a limited capacity to protect oneself from that harm. And also being dependent on others in order to function creates further vulnerability. And Selman talks about it being reasonable to suppose that when we require the services of healthcare workers in general, and nurses in particular, we are or have become more than ordinarily vulnerable. We also drew on the old concept of the sick role, and it's a very well-known concept of the sick role. The sick role is by Parsons, and age-old concept, but I particularly think this is relevant for this work because it very much shows how the sick role creates normative expectations for people's behaviour, particularly patient behaviour in relation to healthcare professionals. So a patient goes into a hospital with the expectation that they're there to get well, and they are supposed to put their trust in the healthcare professional. And because the healthcare professional has a distinct role of being there to make the patient better. We also drew on theories of risk and its relationship to responsibilization. I think this is really important because patients are increasingly urged to be empowered, this idea that we are all empowered to speak up and resist this medical dominance paradigm. We live in a society where good citizens are encouraged to regulate or engage in self-regulation. And this is obviously particularly evident in healthcare, where increasingly patients are encouraged to take care of themselves. And so I think that people are effectively responsibilized to act to minimize risks to themselves. And the downside of that is that they can be held to account should they fail to manage those risks. And this obviously creates tensions for people experiencing hospitalization for acute health conditions. So they're simultaneously vulnerable and dependent on healthcare professionals to protect them from risk, while they're also being responsibilized to speak up and manage their own risk to their safety. So I've also drawn on Strauss and colleagues' work, studies on patient work. And we all know that patients do an awful lot of work when they're hospitalized or when they're ill and unwell. When they go into primary care, they have to do work. So we know about that. but also patients undertake risk work, which is a theory that I'm drawing on that Gale and colleagues and Brown and Gale have written about. And they've written about this concept of risk work in relation to staff and how staff go about managing risks to how they're informing patients about risk. And particularly, Gale and Brown talk about the process of staff searching for certainty when dealing with risk. And I think this has got real relevance for patient involvement in patient safety, because I think patients also undertake risk work. And I'm going to say a bit more about that as I go along. So the methods then. Well, this was a qualitative interview study, and it was conducted over 2 waves. The first wave was conducted between 2016 and 2017, and the second wave between 2017 and 2018. And the reason it was conducted this way is because my PhD was a nested interview study. It was nested within a wider ethnography that was looking at the organisation and the delivery of care in hospitals in England. And the way that I recruited my patients was through that route, really. So all the patients, the 28 acute medical patients, were recruited from 4 hospitals. And there were 2 larger teaching hospitals and 2 smaller hospitals, and they were based on the number of beds. And it involved semi-structured interviews, a mix of face-to-face and telephone interviews with participants who had all been admitted and quite urgently, and they'd been in hospital over the weekend. And they were, as I said, they were recruited from 4 hospitals. And the participants in wave 1, we had 7 men and 6 women. And in wave 2, I had 8 men and 7 women. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the participants now. And apologies for the small screen here, the small font. It's just to fit them all on. All names obviously here are pseudonyms, and the highlighted names are the highlighted patients are those that we managed to get hold of who were aged 40 and below. And I just wanted to highlight for you that the majority of them were above that age. And most of these patients were admitted by ambulance, not just the highlighted ones, but some were referred to hospital by their GP or came into hospital via taxi. And these patients tended to go into A&E first, then onto AMU, and then either were discharged to home or onto a medical ward. And where I recruited them from then was places like the gastroenterology ward, diabetes ward, where else? Respiratory ward, and the AMU. Okay, so that's a bit about the participants then. So I just want to talk to you now about the findings. I'm going to talk particularly to start with looking at this issue of vulnerability and safety. And I'm not sure of the extent to which this would apply now, given the crisis in healthcare that's carried on and grown, and also the COVID-19 pandemic. But at these particular times that I interviewed these patients, many of them saw hospitals as places of safety once they were admitted at the outset of their admission, at least. So Dennis, who was in his 80s and admitted to hospital with a heart condition and breathing problems, he talks about when I was ill, I felt safer in hospital than what I did when I was at home. There was no one here at home, he meant, if anything had gone wrong. That would have been my lot. So there was a real sense of a fear of dying and nobody being there for him. Jeff talks about, being in the right place. And he says, gets you thinking, well, if anything happens, I'm in the best place. Really, if anything did go wrong. And Mike, Jeff was in his 70s, by the way, and was admitted to hospital with a suspected GI bleed and a heart condition. Well, whereas Mike was in his 50s and admitted to hospital following a collapse with a really severe headache. And he talks about being in the right place for the right reasons. So the people looking after me and making sure that whatever it is that I was admitted for, in this case, a suspected bleed, that they were monitoring me enough, which they definitely were. So there was almost a sense of relief that these patients had found their place of safety, if you like, at the outset. But obviously, a lot of patients, as they were going through their journeys, talked about being vulnerable because of their dependency on other people. So, for example, Donald, who was in his 60s, and he took himself to A&E after a severe attack of Crohn's, and it left him quite debilitated. And he says, when you're a patient, you do feel vulnerable. I don't care who you are, as strong as you might be, you feel vulnerable, and you're at the mercy of the help of these people who work in these hospitals. And he says they do a fantastic job. They do their utmost. They do their best. But they're all human, the same as you or I. So we all have our limitations. So you can't be in two places at once. It's just not, you just can't do it. So I also explored then how patients undertook this risk work to manage their vulnerability. And risk work essentially took three forms. So the first form was the patients themselves sought reassurance that they were actually safe in this place. And then they undertook relational work, which I'm going to say a little bit more about. And then being vigilant and speaking up. And I'm going to address each of these in turn. So to start with then, risk work, reassurance seeking. So patients really were concerned when they went into hospital. They wanted to see whether they could trust these people. Would this hospital, would these people look after them? Would they be treated properly? And in order to do that, the patients looked at contextual indicators, things that were going off in the environment. Is it clean? Is this environment clean? Is it orderly? And if it was, they felt reassured. If it wasn't, they became more anxious. And patients also talked about whether there was enough staff on duty. And Donald, again, he talks about there's just not enough staff here. There's just not enough cover. And there are nurses out there who are stressed. They should be off work themselves on a sick note. They're too stressed. And I feel for them because they don't employ enough staff to cover the shifts. And they're forcing these nurses to work double shifts, ridiculous hours, and it's putting patients in danger. So as I said, also alongside contextual indicators that reassured patients that they were safe were relational indicators. So could patients see that people were caring, where staff were caring, and that they could trust them when they were caring for them in the performance of that care. And June, who was, she was in her 80s and she'd collapsed in her GP practice actually with pneumonia, and she'd got sent in from there by ambulance. And she talks about being surrounded by people who are professionals for a start, so knowing what they were doing, and then being in a comfortable bed and being looked after. So safety for patients was very much situated within this concept of care. And she felt cared for. And then the second form of risk work that I just want to talk about is relational work. Patients wanted to be good patients. They wanted to invite staff to give them safe care. And they talked about doing this in this way. So Dennis, for example, says, you do what you're told. You don't try and do what you think you should do. Whereas Walter, who was in his late 70s, and he was admitted following a collapse with breathing difficulties and COPD actually. He says, you know, I've got to do everything in my power to let them do everything that they've got to do and do everything that I'm supposed to do, like taking my nebulizer, because everything is for my benefit. Susan, who she was in her 60s, she was admitted, she had an autoimmune disease, and she'd also deteriorated while she was in hospital, and she'd had pneumonia as well, and she was sent to ICU at one stage. And she talks about feeling a nuisance, and she said, I felt a nuisance always asking for a commode, and so I wanted to be able to walk to the toilet, and I really couldn't. And I found that very frustrating. So yeah, I did sometimes think this would be a great idea. And yes, I could manage it if I could just make that gap between the bed and the next wall, you know. And the nurses were like, no, don't do it. So she says, yeah, I had a role to play to comply. And the third form of risk work was around vigilance, managing unpredictability and dependence. So how a particular concern for patients was their medication, and they monitored their medication quite extensively, actually, even when they didn't sometimes realize that was what they were doing. So Julia talks about, she says, I always ask. And Julia was admitted, she had MS and she was in her 60s, and she'd been admitted following a collapse, and she'd got a problem with her kidneys. I think she'd fallen actually rather than collapsed, but she'd also got a problem with her kidneys. And she talks about always asking, or I find out what I have. I say, why am I having this? What is this? Why did they stop that? Can I have this at another time? And any patient who's got a sort of chronic condition or something who has medicines, they know what they are taking. And there's so much patronisation from the medical nursing teams about that. And Margaret, who was in her 80s, and she had a really long-standing healthcare condition, and she was, I think she was wheelchair bound, and she'd been referred to a GP who'd sent her straight to the gastroenterology department. She had a problem. I think she got a total parental nutrition feed in at the time. And she talks about feeling safer knowing that she's checked everything before I take it. And if there is a tablet appears in my pot and I don't know what it is, I don't take it until I find out. Because sometimes they will just decide to change something or add another tablet in, and they won't have told you what it is for. And so I will not take a different tablet until I found out why it is sitting in the pot with all the others. And alongside this vigilance, several participants spoke up when they were concerned about their care. And Brian, for example, he was in his 60s and he was admitted with an exacerbation of COPD, but he had also had a long-standing heart condition, an underlying heart condition. And he spoke up because he didn't feel he was being heard when he said that his breathing was different. So he says, I went in with a chest complaint. My chest exasperation of COPD it was when I went in. It was quite bad actually, but whilst I was in there, I noticed my chest was improving, but my breathing was getting worse. So I pointed this out to one of the doctors. The doctor who was looking after me, told him I thought I was in heart failure. He said, no, it is this, it is that, it is everything. But he wouldn't sort of say, he thought it wasn't heart failure. And so although Brian knew enough to challenge the doctor's expertise and was familiar with how care should be given, in this instance, his own lay expertise was not enough to overcome the inherent power differences between himself and the doctor. So Brian's experiential knowledge wasn't adequate to inform the doctor's decision-making earlier on in his treatment plan. And here's Walter. And Walter, as I said, he'd collapsed, he'd had difficulties breathing. and he talks about not having his warfarin. And he says, I said, have we got no warfarin tonight, nurse? Because when I went in, I was on 5 milligrams. And she said, well, I haven't got it. Doctor hasn't put it down. I said, I take my warfarin every night. I said, I really should have it every night. And she said, well, I haven't got it. Then the second night I hadn't got it. And Walter did not receive his regular dose of warfarin for 3 nights, despite requesting it on several occasions. And he was discharged from the hospital with a lower dose of warfarin than what he was admitted with. And then when he got home, he had this terrific pain in his chest and his shoulder. And he went back, well, it's back in his shoulder, and he went back to see his regular warfarin nurse at his GP practice. And she made him go straight to the hospital because she suspected a blood clot. It seems to me very much that when patients do speak up, their concerns are only regarded as legitimate when you speak to somebody with that relevant expertise, and then when they give them either an X-ray which identified blood clot or identified that the heart failure was less than 20%. So even after all of this, Walter remained really grateful for the care that he'd received. And it just sort of shows you how the power dynamics in hospitals are not easily overcome. So, as I've said, and so ingrained with the expectations of the sick role, we are the healthcare professionals, you are the patients, that it meant that patients had to really battle to be listened to. So I just want to talk a little bit now in terms of what does this mean, where are we going with this, well, patients sought reassurance that they were safe and conducted relational work and were vigilant to resolve uncertainty. And they wanted to create an environment where people would want to look out for them. And they also looked out for each other as well, which I've not talked about here. But a lot of the concern was about, is this a safe environment for all of us and not just me? So they sought ways in which to make sense and manage risk and vulnerability. And they did that through these ways: reassurance seeking, relational work, and risk work. Now, the way that they activated which role and when varied according to the level of the risk that they perceived was in front of them and where that risk was primarily perceived to stem from. And so the roles of vigilance and relational work, there's this tension between how much should a patient speak up and risk damaging themselves. And there's a tension between the active nature of responsibilization and the more passive nature of the sick role. And that exists within this wider context of responsibilization and the crisis in healthcare in the UK. And our findings show that patients can't always be reflexive, autonomous consumers of healthcare, especially in acute care. So our findings really do contribute to understanding of the function of patient behaviour, and they highlight the roles of risk and vulnerability in influencing the nature of and possibilities for patient involvement and patient safety. And so being involved really does in patient safety carries risks. If patients go along with the healthcare professional by trusting them, they increase their vulnerability and risk potential damage to relationships from challenging healthcare professional expertise. So they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, really. So if they increase their levels of vulnerability from harm if trust is misplaced, and from potential damage to relationships from speaking up and challenging professional health professionals' expertise. And this led me to thinking, well, can we actually move beyond this rhetoric of patient involvement, of patient empowerment at the points of care? What can we do? And I think it's a really difficult situation because we know how much pressure that healthcare is under. but I still think this shows how much relationships need to be at the centre stage of all sort of aspects of healthcare. And a lack of relational care, particularly for older people, really does affect their involvement in healthcare encounters. And Joe Hope and colleagues have talked about this in their research, and they've talked about where staff seem dismissive or distractive. Patients who normally older patients avoid requesting missed care, you know, when they've been missed out on for doing something or having a test. And that is because they fear being seen as bad patients. And Hope and colleagues talk about, you know, unless nursing staff can maintain face as engaged, despite those organisational constraints, patient involvement in hospital care decisions will remain at the level of rhetoric. So, conclusion then. The foregrounding vulnerability, dependency and risk allows us to understand how these concepts shape interactions at the point of care. But it also really highlights why co-creating safety at the point of care is so difficult. And we need to think about how best to support healthcare professionals so that they can elicit concerns for patients and offer assurance that when patients are allowed to speak up and to ask them questions and to challenge them. And I think healthcare organisations really essentially, and patient safety leaders as well, need to find ways of supporting healthcare professionals to create time for staff to actively listen to patients and their concerns on a routine basis. Obviously, as I've mentioned, there are limitations to the study. So this was pre-pandemic, and I wondered to what extent that would be the same now. I think it might be worse. And it also points to the need for advocates, particularly during the real bad waves of COVID, where relatives weren't able to go into hospital to advocate on behalf of patients. I think there might have been some disastrous things that happened. But also, you know, would hospitals still be considered safe from the outset? And I'm not sure about that. Also, we didn't have a very diverse sample of participants. You know, there was quite a lot of people were older, a few younger, but quite a lot of people were older, which does sort of reflect the actual makeup of acute care anyway. And we unfortunately weren't able to recruit no ethnic minority patients. And I think this is a real shame. And I think there needs to be further research done that looks at this issue from patients of different ethnic minority backgrounds. I just want to finish off by showing you this video that I had made that I think might pull together some of the things that I've talked about today that will hopefully crystallise it all for you. And as I said, it's currently being used in medical education in Leicester. And I'm very happy to take feedback on the video as well and any questions that you might have about it at the end. So if I just play that now.
It was okay to ask for things. It wasn't too much trouble. They explained everything to me. So I gradually relaxed and I understood what was going on.
It's safe, you know, it's just... They know what they're doing. They were going to breathe for me. And, you know, that was just a very lovely feeling.
It was my first experience and I found it all, when I got there, overwhelming because I don't know straight away what was going on for the first 2 or 3 days because I felt so ill.
Nobody came when you rang the bell.
Sometimes you were ringing the bell because you were going to be sick. And there was nothing for you to be sick in.
People seemed to come and go past you all the time, and I honestly didn't know what was happening to me.
People rushing around so much day and night. It never stopped. It never stopped.
One day, they give me 2 tablets. Another day, another one would give me 5 tablets. Another day, somebody gave me 6 tablets. Then they give me 1 tablet. And like I was, as I say, some days I just didn't even know what tablets I was taking.
I was really getting worried now, because nobody seemed to listen to me. And I know, in my heart of hearts, it was something to do with my heart. And that's because of the way I was breathing.
I was starting to feel that I was dying. You know, I was struggling to take another breath.
Fear, anxiety, confusion. Hospitals and medical centres across the UK are being impacted by the pandemic, a reduction in budgets, failures in communication, workforce crisis, lack of resources and conflicting priorities. For patients, safety is created in their interactions with staff through reassurance, when they feel they can trust the hospital and staff to care for them while they're at their most vulnerable. Involvement, when they get regular information around what is happening. Patients want to play a role in keeping themselves safe, but they need information to do so. Self-care, when they're able to have an element of control over their self-care, such as routines and preferences. A listening ear, when they feel confident in speaking up when they have concerns, knowing that staff are there to listen. When these simple things happen, patients can work together with staff to improve the safety of their own care. To find out more or to have your say, head over to our website.
And following that, here's my references. And just to say acknowledgements to all the participants who spoke to us, and many thanks to the NIHR for funding the research. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Liz. This is where you'd be getting applause if we weren't virtual. Thank you, that was brilliant. I loved the video actually, and I'm sure other people will talk about that. That was one of the most effective sort of video explainers about some of this stuff that I've seen. So amazing. I might start. I'm going to invite some questions on the chat if people have got questions, but I just wanted to start with an observation really, because I think for me, you've sort of articulated and crystallized something that I've really thought a lot about since I started my patient safety journey back in 2010. And you know, we were going out onto wards and we were talking to people about their care, and whenever we used the term sort of safety events or patient safety incidents or anything like that, I was very struck about how people just didn't want to talk to me about it. And we had these 2 sister studies that were going on at the time, and one of them was asking patients about contributory factors, so general things, you know, how warm was it, what, you know, how were the alarm bells, you know, were they responded to, what's the environment like, were you treated with dignity and respect, all of these sorts of things. And they were having great success talking to patients. Whereas I was on the study where actually we went and we said, have you got any concerns that you want to share with us? Has anything happened to you? And people just, I mean, some people spoke to us and we got some stuff, but actually when we went in with that lens, people just didn't want to talk to us as much. And I was always very struck and sort of was mulling it over in my head about, like, it's almost as if by articulating it and saying it out loud was to recognise that people were super vulnerable and that they didn't want to think about the bad things that could happen, and all of that sort of stuff. So they were much more comfortable talking about broader issues. But actually, any time you sort of use that word safety or things that have happened or gone wrong, they just didn't want to speak to us in the same way. And then when we put those two studies together, and it became the praise intervention, the one that you referenced earlier, we got much more data about that when we were combining those two aspects of it. But it was just so lovely to hear you articulate all of this stuff, because, as I say, it's been sort of niggling me at the back of my mind, you know, all of this time, like thinking about how, you know, what does that mean? Why don't people talk about it? And I think you've really nicely, I think, conceptualized it and brought that, some of that stuff together and verbalized it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I don't know whether you've got this experience as well of when you ask them, what does patient safety mean to you? What? I got what makes you feel safe? So then you rephrase it and say, what makes you feel safe? And then I got the information. But I think what really helped me was being able to take people's phone numbers and talk to them away from the hospital, because in the first wave we had to recruit in the hospital and do the interview where possible in the hospital, and very often patients didn't want to say an awful lot about, as you've alluded to, they felt vulnerable. And there's something about being in the care of other people, you know, I can't say anything bad about them, because if I do, they might take it out on me, or the vulnerability really does come to the fore. So I think interviewing patients away from home, which I did, best thing ever, because they were able to talk about, oh yeah, when I had that experience, and didn't feel like they were being pressurized. Because I remember distinctly going to recruit a chap in the first wave, and I said to him, you know, I'm doing a study about, you know, hospital care at the weekend, because it was set within this wider ethnographic study. And I also wondered if you would like to talk to us about any concerns that you might have. And he said, oh yeah, no, I've got things to say, yeah. And so came back to him later on to take consent, and he went, no, nurse has told me not to talk to you.
My goodness.
Yeah. So that set me thinking as well. So I totally agree with you. I think there's something about being in that hospital bed at the mercy, as that chap said, of other people, that leaves you concerned about being a bad patient, somebody not treating you right. Yeah,
and I certainly think that is the case. And I wonder almost, I think the term that I've used in the past is suspension of disbelief. So in the same way, when you go into a theatre, you suspend disbelief that you're in a theatre, and you try to immerse yourself in the idea that this is reality. And in hospital, in some ways, it's similar. Like, I don't like flying very much, and whenever I get onto a plane, I try to sort of suspend disbelief that I'm however many thousand, you know, feet in the air, and I think that helps me in that, you know, because I think there's no point me sitting here worrying about all the possible things that could happen or whatever it is. And so I think there's an element of that which overlays that obvious feeling of vulnerability, that, you know, your life is in their hands. It's also just a very functional thing, isn't it, to try and to reduce your anxiety, to not think about stuff. And as you know, as a patient safety researcher or quality care researcher, you know, whenever you go in the hospital now, it's a completely different environment, isn't it? You see everything. I'm going to bring in my colleague Will here, because he did have something to talk about with respect to the undergraduate curriculum. I wondered if actually you wanted to speak, Will, and ask your question.
I think I thought of a more interesting question first, if that's all right. But I'm a medical doctor, and I'm being sort of entering the world of patient safety research. So just as Jane was just saying, I think then about going back into work and with a different pair of glasses on, you know, looking at the environment. But I've often thought about I don't know if from your work or what you've done, whether you have any idea of what patients might think of being more involved in their safety. And I guess what I mean is, if I said to a patient, you know, if I told them, or could I recruit them into managing their own safety on the ward, is what I mean, I guess. And there'll probably be some immediate reactions to that, but I was just interested if that's something that you've come across or thought about, or the patients talked about. Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the patients that I spoke to were really poorly, so or were so frightened and overwhelmed that to go up to somebody and say, oh, how do you feel about being involved in your own safety? And I think the issue is, I'm here to get well, you know, and it's almost like, well, you want me to do your job for you type thing. And I'm not saying that they wouldn't naturally do that, because they do, but there's this tension between, you know, well, I've just got to do what the doctor says, and this being responsibilized to check everything. And as I've said, patients do that, but if you actually termed it in that way, how do you feel about, oh, I'm not sure. And I understand why you're saying it as well. I think it's finding a different way of saying it might be beneficial. I mean, even if you showed them videos, you know, about, or talk to them about, it depends what you want. Again, it depends on your perspective of what safety is, doesn't it? Because you're coming at it very much from avoiding harms, incidents and errors, and patients don't see safety in that way. They see it about relationship, about being cared for. So it's much more difficult to funnel it off as safety is about this to patients, because for patients it's about the whole quality of their care. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's sort of where I'm coming from. Does that help? Yeah, no, that's great. I was just interested to hear your opinions. And then it just very quickly, the other thing was, as I put in the chat, I'm just interested, as a medical school tutor at the minute, I just the concepts you're talking about, I don't think come up in medical education much, and I'd be really interested to know how I could integrate that, particularly as mostly I do simulation at the minute, and I think there'd be an opportunity to introduce some of these concepts into that. So I don't know whether it's possible to and the video, whether we can use that, or yes, with pleasure, as long as you say where it's from, and that would be fine. I'd be delighted. And if you could let me know when you do, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, log that impact, Liz. Okay, I'm going to bring in my colleague Beth, because I know she'll have a load of questions from the stuff that you've done, because we're doing very, very related work. Beth.
Liz, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And I've done many research projects over the last few years focusing specifically about medication safety in different settings, and usually using a safety 2 framework. And right. I mean, I've had numerous conversations with Jane around this over the years, and how you know, people in different care settings, and particularly across care transitions, we've found have actually been performing a really under-recognised role in maintaining safety. So in you know, in their ability to take action, or to raise concerns, or to do things that they would just see to be as the day-to-day, that's what they do, you know, sort of saying if a medication is missing, creating a checklist themselves of the things that they might be expecting, brokering communication between healthcare professionals, either, you know, ones in the same organisations or ones working in different organisations. So we found that they're creating these props to the system all the time, and often making sure that outcomes are safe, whereas they might not have been safe had they not taken those actions. Yeah. Or there would have been a greater risk of them being unsafe if they hadn't taken those actions. But I was really struck when you were answering Will's question then about the language that you said, that patients don't really understand patient safety, and I agree. You know, it's really difficult, and we've tried to work with people to create a definition of it, and it's really a layperson friendly definition, and it's really tricky to do. But I guess my observation, really, I'm not sure it's a question, or maybe I will come to a question at the end of this, but I was just wanted to observe that in a couple of studies, what we've been able to ascertain really is that people talk about things being really inconvenient, you know, rather than unsafe. But, you know, things like medications being missing, not being given the ones that they're expecting, or getting, you know, their previous medications when they should have had their new medications. And they talk about it in ways that, oh, that was just really inconvenient and it took me ages to sort it out and get to the bottom of it. So they talk about those sorts of things. So it's a weak signal really, isn't it, where people are raising these things that they might not see as unsafe. But interestingly, when you get healthcare professionals, if you extract those patient safety incidents out of patient accounts and get healthcare professionals to rate whether they think that were a safety incident or not, and then the severity of it, and they always say, yes, that was really serious, and it was put that patient at risk. So I guess my question is, you know, what potential do you think is there for putting into place mechanisms to pick up on these weak signals that come from patients in these environments where you wouldn't necessarily want them to term it in the terms of this is safe or unsafe, but, you know, how could you term it in language which isn't quite so frightening to people?
That's a good question. That is a really good question. I think I don't know whether there's something that needs to happen when patients are admitted, talking from the acute medical patient's angle, or when a patient goes to a GP, where they talk to patients about, you know, do you realise if you didn't take this medication, what would happen? It's something as simple like that, where you could get to ascertain what the depth of knowledge they had about if they missed that or got the wrong dose, or what do you think would happen? Just to ask them, and then sort of start a discussion. Well, it's really important then that, you know, we talk about what medication you're on and what purpose it serves.
I guess so.
Very much my notion of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I mean, obviously, sometimes we try to move beyond the adherence discussions, don't we? And sort of, you know, because we found that patients often are picking up on the fact they were given the wrong thing, so they shouldn't have been on them in the first place. You know, something should have been stopped ages ago, and they're no longer taking it. So how you pick up on that sort of intelligence about their sort of niggles, concerns, you know, things that they wouldn't ever style as being unsafe. But yeah, what your work really resonated with work that we've done over the years. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Margaret, I think I'm going to just cross over your question, if you don't mind, because I feel like it's probably been subsumed within Beth, so I hope that's okay. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask a question from Maria here from the University of Leicester as well, you may know that. And just to ask a question about if there were any contextual differences between the 4 hospitals that which might have made them feel different in terms of how safe they felt.
That's a really good question as well. There probably was, but it wasn't something that I looked at in depth. But, you know, the teaching hospitals would normally be much busier, and their AMUs were really, as the video showed, people coming and going day and night. But all of the patients, wherever they were from, talked about the same sorts of things as being of concern. So yeah, no, I don't think it wasn't something that I specifically looked at, but I do think it was probably there underlying that quite a lot of the patients who had been to the very busy hospital, teaching hospitals, were very much aware of how it's uncertainty provoking, isn't it? I mean, if you're sat in an environment, you know, if you're just in an environment that everybody's dashing around and things aren't wiped up off the floor, or, you know, that you can't, it's that's going to get to you as feeling that, oh, is this a place I can trust? You know, so to answer Maria's question specifically, no, but I'm sure that there was something on the larger hospitals. But both hospitals were equally talked about in the same ways.
Thanks, Liz. Well, you may have heard, because I did have my mic on, that the bell was tolling there, and it tells me that it's past. So I am going to cut that short, but there were a couple of questions for you, Liz, in the chat there, if you want to take a look.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming along and presenting to us today. I think you can tell from the discussion that you're very much at home with us in terms of how you're thinking about this stuff, and we really then look forward to reading the paper, which you say is under review. Social science medicine.
Social science and medicine.
Oh, good
if
stuff.
they don't reject it now.
Great stuff, and we'll keep everything crossed. So yes, thanks so much, Liz. Just to say to everybody who's here, there will be another one of these coming up. Beth, I think we're asking, is it Maria Moore, to present to us, and we'll be giving that date out shortly. So look for that on our usual channels. Gosh, I sound like an Instagram influencer there, don't I? On our usual channels, check us out on the YouTube or on Twitter. So thanks everyone for listening, and I wish you the best of, I'd say the best of luck. Wish you a lovely day.
Thank you, and you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Liz.